quit my job today. Not like quit, but gave my 2 weeks notice.
I know. I was so nervous for you. I was like sweating all day. I was like, "Oh my god, oh my god."
I've never quit a job before in my entire life. So this was
Really?
definitely, but I wasn't like it wasn't nerve-wracking, but it could not have been a worse day. Like there was all this shit going down at the end of the day. And for those who don't know, I left TV for a little bit and I'm a scheduler now, but I resigned because I have a TV gig lined up for middle of December. So
Whoop
I'm
whoop.
back, baby. But yeah, so somebody had a heart attack today at the end of the day, and
Oh
I'm
my
like,
god.
"Hey, I have this resignation letter." It was I don't know. It's invigorating. I'm excited to be back doing what I love, but it's still hard.
It's still hard. I still think you should have given them a sympathy card. Like, I'm sorry for your loss." The loss is me.
33, 1, 0. Main event of the evening. Wednesday and half past the hour.
It's Tuesday, and you're listening to Murder Unscripted.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Murder Unscripted. I'm your host, Ed Hydock, along with my partner in crime, Melissa Spivey.
What's up?
You're asking me, or are you just saying what's up?
Just kinda saying what's up. I already know what's up with you. I've
You
talked to you
do.
all day.
You do. Well, Melissa, we are in week 2 of our December recap, where we're recapping basically all of the blocks that we've done so far on Murder Unscripted and in 2024. So right now we're talking about cases that we didn't get a chance to cover the first time around when we were in the block. And this week we're throwing it back to July 2024 when we did a block on hedonistic thrill killers. It was a 2-parter on Cosmo DiNardo, the kid who lured all his friends to that farm and just did the unspeakable. So this is basically a block where people commit murders for absolutely no reason other than they thought it was fun, which is the worst kind to me, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree, and that was, like, a crazy block. We also laid out all the different types of killers, and just an FYI, I Googled it today. The FBI still has not made up a serial killer type flowchart, so that's rude.
It's the least they could do. Like, they have nothing
Thank
else to do
you.
right now. Come on.
I just need to call the FBI. Can you just Google their phone number?
FBI.gov. I think it is FBI.gov.
I think it is. Good one. Moving on. So in that block, like you said, we covered the Lost Boys of Bucks County. We covered the really sad murder of 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton by her 15-year-old neighbor, crazy bitch, Alyssa Bustamante.
Crazy is right.
And of course, the case of Stanley Edwards, which was a case that like broke you and me.
Destroyed. Like, I've never felt
Destroyed,
so
yes.
vulnerable. And it's funny for our listeners, we actually got a really nice message from someone who was a childhood friend of Stanley Edwards. So, Melissa, you had pulled that case out of the abyss. I had never heard that case before, and we must have reached somebody. So I know we don't have a huge following yet, but whoever reached out to us, I won't say his name, but he was a friend of Stanley's and shared some really cool memories of Stanley. So it was nice to reach that one person who mattered and to hear a little bit more about Stanley from someone who actually knew him. And you had mentioned to me that your case today was kind of equally chaotic, like that Stanley Edwards case. And you haven't told me much about it, though, other than it happened at the Jersey Shore. So I think we should get right into it.
I think so too. And yeah, this case is wild and it's unhinged. Someone else who's wild and unhinged, Richard Biegenwald. So, this man would also later become known as the Jersey Shore Thrill Killer. I have to say, though, I would love to talk to Dr. Buzz at some point and pick his brain on this guy. Like, the whole time I was researching, I kept being like, I wonder what Buzz would say about that. Because Richard Biegenwald was just I mean, throughout my research, the common theme was that he was odd, he was evil, but above all else, he was like a giant mystery. Like,
Hmm.
no one could figure this guy out. And it just kept coming up that people couldn't get a read on him, they
Yeah.
couldn't make sense of him, and they couldn't make sense of his actions. And they just never really were able to make sense of the motive for his murders, which is very unsettling.
That is unsettling because that usually you want a reason, and I know families do when these cases end. You want to you don't just want a conviction. You want to know why did you kill my loved one? Like that's as important as the actual conviction. So when you don't get that, it's tough.
And he left so much unanswered. For my research, the main source that I used was a book entitled The Jersey Shore Thrill Killer, Richard Biegenwald, which was written by a gentleman named John E. O'Rourke.
Oh, he was a New Jersey State Trooper, wasn't he?
Yes, he
O'Rourke.
was.
Yeah, yeah. I like when retired police and retired detectives write books because I feel like you get the real firsthand story, like from the people who lived it and investigated it. Like they're always more interesting to me.
Yes, I 100% agree. And he's actually written a few other true crime books since he wrote this one.
Mhm.
And I
Cool.
got this book on Amazon if you're interested. And I also watched an episode of The World's Most Evil Killers, which again, I watched on Amazon. So there's a lot to this case, and most sources kind of laid it out the same way. So we're going to kind of jump back and forth in time. But for now, we will start with Richard. So Richard Fran Biegenwald was born on August 24th, 1940. And he was an only child to his parents, Albert and Sally. And to say this household was dysfunctional would be a massive understatement. Albert was a total asshole. He had actually lost his leg in an accident when he was a child, and he was just an angry and mean drunk who paid very little attention to his wife and son unless he was like verbally and or physically abusing them.
It's awful.
Yeah, and then Sally, Richard's mom, I had a hard time figuring her out. Like some reports said she was emotionally distant and neglectful, but I didn't get that vibe from her.
Hmm.
I also saw that she was described as timid and well educated, or I'm sorry, and not well educated.
Okay.
I think that she loved her son very much. I think she was a little naive, and I do feel like she tried her best to get him the help that he needed. Because as I'm about to talk about, like, even at a very young age, and we're talking about like when he was a toddler, it was obvious that something was definitely not right with him. And to be clear, I am not saying that Sally was a good mom, but I do think she tried. So, Ed and listeners, you'll have to tell me, like, once you hear what happens with her, like, what you think.
Yeah, because this has been coming up a lot lately, and I feel especially in the wake of our interview with Dr. Buzz, like children having these awful upbringings and then turning into complete monsters. And I have to say that my views on everything changed pretty dramatically after talking to Buzz because it was the James Cushing case that he waited on, that the Lizzie
Mhm.
Borden, the guy who mimicked Lizzie Borden. Because I'm starting to really feel more and more that these killers, even if they had good, wholesome parents, like that sometimes those parents didn't recognize the signs or didn't do enough. And
Yeah.
then I start to really wonder if it was their upbringing or if it was something they were just they were born like this. So I don't know. I'm having mixed feelings lately.
So, back to Richard. As I said, he showed very odd behavior, like, at a super young age. In one of the TV shows, they were talking about how when he was a toddler, Richard had very strange body movements and he would just stop and stare at something. I don't have kids, so I don't know if that's weird. I don't know.
Kids are weird. It's tough to tell. It's like I think all kids are weird.
Right. Like, and as he got a little older, and by older, I only mean like 3 or 4 years old, he became a menace and he was so out of control. He was violent, aggressive, he was deviant. And of course, his father's way of dealing with this was to ruthlessly beat and abuse him, which made Richard act out even more. And at the ripe age of 5 years old, Richard tried to set his house on fire with his father in it.
5?
5.
Wow. I didn't think you knew how to start a fire at 5.
Oh, he did. Something else you're going to find out about him is he is very, very intelligent. So by now, Richard's parents, or at least his mother, Sally, knew that Richard needed help. So after the arson incident, he was sent to the Rockland County Psychiatric Center. And over the next few years, he was mostly in a psychiatric facility, including Bellevue Hospital.
Hmm.
So one would hope that these extended stays in these facilities would be beneficial, but one would be very wrong. Um, Richard ended up being diagnosed with several conditions, including schizophrenia. And as we learned in our Slender Man episode, it is incredibly rare for a child or even like a young teenager to be diagnosed with that.
You really don't see that in children much. It's usually after you're 18 that they get diagnosed.
Right. And just a reminder, like, we're in the 1940s and 50s. So I don't know what factors they used to reach that diagnosis. And unfortunately, detailed medical records were not kept. So we don't really know the particulars. But regardless, some of the air quotes treatments that Richard was given, and he's 8 years old at this point, they used electroshock therapy on him.
On an 8-year-old, wow. And I'm wondering if that was if we're just shocked by it because it's 2024, or if that, like, back in 1940, maybe that was no big deal. Maybe that was common practice.
I think that they use that. I mean, I know they use it for a lot of quote unquote conditions that like
Mhm.
didn't really exist, and but it's basically like torture, I feel like.
Yeah, and they would do lobotomies were big back then. Like, there were a lot of
Yeah.
weird practices.
Well, another treatment they gave him was to strip him naked, wrap him in cold wet blankets, and make him like sleep on a table. And he would later tell people that he would have to pee himself, like, just to stay warm. So, is it any wonder this kid is so messed up?
No, and it sounds like you're describing medieval torture devices and not
Right.
therapy, you know?
It's crazy, like, the stuff they did to him, and during these years, Richard's just in and out of these facilities. When he's out, he would be sent to his parents' house just for, like, a weekend visit every now and then. He began smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, and gambling. An 8-year-old.
Jeez, I taught my 8-year-olds, my kids know how to gamble, but, like, play money, like
Yeah.
3-card money, man. Don't don't try them.
I'm trying to picture this 8-year-old with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth and a bottle wrapped in a paper bag. Like, what?
You hitting or you staying?
The 40s was a different time. Unfortunately, though, at some point he did begin torturing animals, and we know what can happen to children who are cruel to animals.
Remember the McDonald triad? That was, like, one of the big 3.
Right, and that gives them, like, the potential to grow up to be cruel adults who often become killers. Like, we hear that about a lot of killers. And when Richard would come home on these little trips, he was stealing from his mother and, like, breaking into other neighbors' houses and stealing from them. Eventually, and I think this is when he was like 9 or 10 years old, he was sent to the state school for boys, and this was essentially a home for boys who couldn't stay out of trouble. And
Hmm.
it was here that we got a little bit more insight on Richard. So, psychologists would note that Richard had an obsession with death, with one doctor saying that he felt Richard, quote, had an extreme fantasy of death, end quote.
Hmm.
And on top of that, Richard was just a horrible little demon while he was at this school. Like, he was constantly starting problems, tormenting the staff and the students, making escape, like getting kids to escape. Like, he was just creating so much chaos.
I'm no psychologist, obviously, but I feel like that should be a bigger warning sign. Like, I don't, maybe it is, but kids that are fascinated with death and, like, draw pictures and there's blood everywhere and there's weapons involved. Like, the kids are so innocent that they have to be taught that stuff or exposed to it. And I feel like that fascination at an early age will undoubtedly lead to problems because what comes after fascination? Like, what else can I do to someone or something? So that's when the violence toward animals starts and the violence toward people and other children in your classroom. So I feel like it should be a definite red flag.
Yeah, and I do think there's a fine line though between like a child being interested in death, maybe like what happens after you die or like the decomposition you know what I mean? Like there's differences. But the
Mhm.
fact that he was just like obsessed with death and yeah, like you said, torturing animals and
Yeah.
so on and so forth, these red flags are on fire at this point.
Mhm.
But again, they're putting him in these centers and these facilities and these homes. What else were they supposed to do, I
Right.
guess?
Yeah, you're trying. I mean, that's an effort.
Right. So at some point in his early teen years, he must have gotten himself together a little bit because at the age of 16, he graduated from the 8th grade and it was decided that he could live at home with his mother, who thankfully had left abusive Albert after years of, his bullshit. And Richard was allowed to enroll at a local public school, which he lasted just a few months before he was over it and dropped out. And in a surprise to no one, he continued on this path of like degeneracy. And just a side note here, and this is completely my speculation, but I'm guessing that Richard was able to fool his doctors and teachers and assessor people into thinking that he was quote unquote better. And that's how he was released to his mother and sent to public school. But we also need to remember Richard was very, very intelligent. Like, apparently, he had a very high IQ. And as we'll see later, he is very easily able to manipulate people into thinking he's rehabilitated. So he's dropped out of school and he decides to go down south. There isn't a ton of information about this time in his life, but he began stealing cars and eventually he was caught when he crossed state lines in a stolen vehicle, which is a felony. So this landed him in a detention center in Kentucky. And in the Jersey Shore thrill killer book I referenced, it kind of mentioned that it was like during this time in his life that Richard's dark fantasies, like fantasizing about committing murders, those started to become more and more prevalent in his mind. I don't think he could ignore it or push it down anymore. So Richard was released later that year. It was 1958. And he returned home to New Jersey. Oh, I'm sorry, to Staten Island to live with his mother. And on December 18th, 1958, Richard is 18 years old. And this is when he commits his first murder at 18. So he and a friend, Jimmy Sparnroft, Jimmy and Richard decided to go to this little town of Bayonne, New Jersey, which is like 20 minutes north of Staten Island. And they're looking for a store to rob. And I haven't mentioned much about Richard's appearance, but he was very like distinct looking. He wasn't necessarily bad looking when he was young, but he did stand out. He had like a sort of strawberry blondish hair that made him memorable. And apparently he had these really, really intense bright blue eyes.
Hmm.
And I'm only bringing this part up because Richard and Jimmy would alter Richard's appearance before the robbery. And they would use makeup and mascara and stuff like that. And they would paint his eyebrows and stuff a different color.
Could you imagine like Richard going to Jimmy and being like, "I want to rob someplace," and he was like, "Yeah, clown boy, about that." And
Exactly.
you're pretty identifiable.
Listen, Bozo the Clown, we got to cover that shit
Put
up.
this concealer on.
Exactly. Like, they would, like, sit in the car, and, like, I'm just imagining, like, Jimmy pulling out his big caboodles case of MAC makeup, and he's like, "All right, we got this.
All right, you want a smoky eye today?
Let's highlight those cheekbones." So, Jimmy and Richard are driving around, and they passed a couple of stores, but there were too many people in them. So, they come across this small grocery store, and it was like a corner store, I think. And it happened to be owned by 47-year-old Steven Sladowski and his wife. So they had 4 children and they were respected members of the community in Bayonne. And they had recently opened this store and Steven was working the closing shift. And while he liked working at like their little family store, this wasn't his primary job. Steven owned a law firm and he was an assistant municipal prosecutor in Monmouth County.
Wow. This wasn't just your local shopkeep. This was somebody.
Exactly.
And I'm guessing Richard and Jimmy didn't know this when they committed this act, or they might have thought twice.
Yeah, they're not that bright.
Hmm.
So Richard goes into the store while Jimmy stays in the car, like ready to make a quick getaway. And of course, we only have Richard's account of what happened when he like walked into that store, but we know that he used a sawed-off shotgun to shoot and kill Steven Sladowski.
Why is he coming in there blasting? Like, do we know if Steven reached for a gun or he fought back or like picked up the phone or something? Like, does something sparked him to just open fire?
No,
Oh,
Steven didn't do anything. So Richard claims he shot Steven because he wouldn't give Richard money, but it's pretty much decided and speculated, but decided that Richard never had any interest in the money. This was just about killing for a thrill.
well, yeah. Was any money missing? I mean, if they didn't even
No,
bother to rob the,
that's
so yeah, money's bullshit at that point.
exactly. He just did this for fun. And he didn't realize who he was shooting. I mean, unfortunately, was probably a bigger deal than the average Joe. So after Richard shoots Steven, he runs out to the car, and as Jimmy is frantically driving away, Richard then shoots through the front window of the store. I have no idea why, but they drive a little bit away, a couple blocks away. They ditch the stolen car, and they hop on the ferry, which would take them back to Staten Island. And this murder just devastated this little town. And the day after the murder, Richard is kind of freaking out, and he's insisting that he and Jimmy need to flee anywhere just to get out of the area because of all this publicity surrounding the murder of a prosecutor.
You know what it reminds me of? When I lived up in Allentown and Bethlehem in Lehigh Valley. That's where our Denise Sam Callie story took place.
Mm-hmm.
There were similar problems because when Route Interstate 78 was put in, people were committing crimes in the Lehigh Valley, and they were back in New York City by the time police even knew what happened. Like before they even knew a crime happened. This reminds me of that. Like you commit a crime, you hop a ferry, and you're out of town before anybody even really gets news that anything bad's gone down.
Right. And they had actually been like planning this. Like they figured out what time the ferry would
I'm
leave, what time it would
sure.
come. Like
Yeah, I'm
they had all
sure.
this very planned out. So it's like, for as smart as Richard is, because we know he's very intelligent, he's also a dumb shit.
Hmm.
So they steal a car and just start driving south. And this is wild. So while they're driving, they get pulled over, and this is in Delaware. Richard proceeds to shoot at the officer who pulled him over. He just starts shooting.
Well, of course he did. Why not at that point?
Well, thank God the bullet only grazed this officer's cheek, but Richard and Jimmy managed to get away until they found themselves in another shootout with police, this time in Maryland. This time, Richard was hit in the cheek and both men were arrested.
Great.
Yeah. Well, no, not great.
Yeah, I was like, shouldn't
So,
the story be over at this
yeah,
point?
happy ending. We're all
Yeah.
done.
Not so much.
When Richard and Jimmy go to trial, Richard's lawyer tried to be like, Richard needs help. The hospitals have failed him. And the judge, who obviously knew Steven Sladowski and he had had the privilege of working with him, this judge was not having any excuses. And he pointed out that Richard had spent the majority of his life getting help and it didn't work.
And you're going up against a judge who has experience with this prosecutor and may even be friends with him outside of the courtroom. So, I mean, you're good luck getting any sympathy there.
Well, and the judge said something during the trial about, like, Steven Sladowski was, like, one of the finest men that I know, you know?
Hmm.
So, Richard was ultimately sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole.
Hmm.
Now, it should be noted that he could have been up for the death penalty, but Steven's widow, who is a kinder woman than I am, she said she didn't want Richard to get the death penalty. She said he was a young man and there had already been enough bloodshed. And I don't want to blame her. I know she probably thought she was trying to do the right thing. Maybe I'm not
People are way too sympathetic.
well, and
Way too
I'm
sympathetic.
not, and this might be a controversial thing to say, but I am not a proponent of rehabilitation. I don't think there is such a thing for most people. So she obviously felt that there was. So in prison, Richard acts exactly how you would expect him to act. And he spent a ton of time in solitary confinement. Like, he was in there once for 11 months straight.
God, that's a long time. I could be
That's a
there for
long,
11 minutes. I'd start
I know.
getting all itchy. Yeah.
He just couldn't lay low. He had to always be causing some kind of problem. But after a couple years, he must have realized that, like, if he ever wanted to get parole, he needed to shape up and fly right, or whatever that saying is.
God, you're old. You are so old. You make fun of me. No one says ship up and
My
fly right.
mom says it.
So good.
So suddenly, Richard transforms into the world's best inmate. And in 1975, 17 years into his life in prison sentence, he was released on good behavior. So, everybody, round of applause for the justice system.
This is infuriating to me. And you kill a prosecutor, you almost kill a cop, and 17 years is your slap on the wrist. And when will we learn?
And see, this behavior is why I felt like he did the same thing at that state school for boys. I feel like he was able to put on this facade of a model student and upstanding young man, just like he did in prison. So Richard is released. He moves back home to mom's house, still in Staten Island, and he gets like random odd jobs to make money. But soon he makes his way into the soft white underbelly of organized crime.
Natural progression, I think.
Obviously.
Yeah.
So Staten Island is rumored to be home to many a mobster.
Wink, wink.
Wink, wink. So on this world's most evil killer show, they had Richard's defense attorney on the show, Lou Diamond. Lou Diamond is a trip.
Is he selling watches behind the courthouse?
Lou Diamond is allegedly like lawyer to the mob.
No.
So Lou is on this show just talking about Richard and how he was hired as a, quote, collector.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the person that the bosses would send in to get people to pay up. And during this time, according to Lou, Richard was driving around at night, picking up sex workers and shooting them with a .22. And Lou is just like jabbering away on the show about this. So, wait, Lou gets better and better. Not really, but he explains why Richard chose a .22 as his weapon of choice. He liked how the bullets would rattle around in his victim's skull.
Wow.
This is what Lou is telling us on this TV show. So he talks about how in 1978, he was asked to represent Richard, and Richard is now in jail accused of rape. But Lou was talking about how Richard is very unique looking, like I described earlier, with the reddish blonde hair and these super intense blue eyes. So when Lou goes to meet with Richard, who's in jail on these rape charges, he talks to Richard. They have like their client whatever meeting. And as he goes to leave, he tells Richard that he has a very interesting hair color. Oh, and by the way, we might have a lineup tomorrow. And he walks out. Well, the next day, they bring Richard in for this lineup. He walks in looking like Mr. Clean with his shiny ass bald head. And the woman was unable to identify her attacker in the lineup, and the case was dropped. So let this sink in. And this is the part that I was fuming about, like right before we went to record Jamie Shearer's episode last week. And I was like so angry. And like I told you earlier that Richard was a very intelligent man. He knew how to read between the lines. And because we don't have a legal team and we need to watch what we say, this is where I'm going to end the on-air portion of this conversation. But that is foul. That's disgusting and horrifying.
Well, it doesn't take a legal expert to tell you that this guy like absolutely manipulated the system. And if Lou Diamond, if he's like, we're having a lineup tomorrow, you got some funny looking hair, wink, wink, like Lou's kind of culpable as well about helping his client. And we've talked about defense attorneys before. I don't know, but I feel like all this manipulation, because I know that we're only about halfway through this story, that there's more to come. There's going to be some ramifications for all these little games they're playing, and it's people's lives.
We haven't even scratched the surface of this nightmare.
God.
So we're in 1980 now, and as if Richard couldn't get any shittier, he says, "Hold my beer," and he begins dating his 16-year-old neighbor, Diane.
Oh,
He is 40 years old. 40. She is 16. He could literally be her father.
he's got Steven Shearer vibes from last week. I mean, this guy, between him and Steven, they are literally the worst of humanity. The worst.
100% terrible, terrible humans. So Diane is obviously still in high school, and apparently she was a very smart girl from a good family. She was on honor roll. She had dreams of going to college and like being someone and doing things. And her family was horrified that their teenage daughter was dating a convicted murderer more
Yeah.
than twice her
You
age.
think? God.
So Richard goes back to prison. I think it was on a parole violation. And while there, he and Diane get married.
No.
So that's lovely because I'm sure everyone's like Pinterest board for their dream wedding includes a cavity search and the groom in an orange jumpsuit. Right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. We're not talking about yours. We're talking about other people.
Oh, got it. So they get married, whatever. So Richard is released from prison and he and his bride move to Asbury Park, New Jersey. And it is part of the infamous or famous, whichever you pick, Jersey Shore. And the Jersey Shore is like a collection of beaches and towns like up the eastern coast of New Jersey. And just an FYI, not all of the Jersey Shore towns are how MTV portrays them. I promise. Or I'm sorry, again, depending on how you want to see it. Fun fact, Bruce Springsteen is from Asbury Park, hence the name of his first album, Greetings from Asbury Park, NJ.
Bruce doesn't mince words. He's born in the USA because I was born in the USA.
So Richard and Diane are newly married, and for a little while, I guess they're, living in a drug-fueled wedded bliss, because, not what you do. And during this time, so we're in like 1982 at this point, Richard was not having any interactions with police. But if you think that he cleaned up his act and turned into a fine, upstanding citizen, then this is clearly your first day in the world of true crime. Welcome.
Yeah, welcome to the club.
Welcome.
He doesn't. I'm telling you, he doesn't clean up his act.
Spoiler alert, he doesn't clean it up. He doesn't straighten up and fly right, or whatever that stupid saying is. All right, so at this point, we're going to fast forward a little bit to January of 1983. And a couple of little boys are playing in this little woodsy area that was behind a Burger King when they come across human remains. And the remains were pretty much decomposed and skeletal at this point. Police were able to tell that it was the body of a female. She was partially dressed, but she didn't have shoes on, and her shoes weren't anywhere around the crime scene. The cause of death was several gunshots to her head, like all at super close range.
Wow.
And it was determined that this person had been dead for several months. So this body is a Jane Doe for about a week, and then investigators figure out they have the body of 18-year-old Anna O. Lesowitz. And I hope I'm saying her last name right, but that's how everyone said it. Anna had disappeared in August, so the year before, so like 5 months prior to her body being found. She and a friend were visiting the friend's uncle at his Asbury Park beach house, and the girls decided to go to the boardwalk. And while they were there, the friend was like, I have to go to the bathroom, but I am not trying to use a public bathroom. So she decides to run back to her uncle's house.
She went back to the house.
Yeah. And it's like really late now, like midnight. But Anna's like, no, I'm just going to wait here. I'll wait here for you. I'll see you when you get back. So she sits on a bench, no big deal. Fran runs home, does her thing, and she gets back to the boardwalk pretty quickly, but Anna isn't there. And there would be no trace of Anna until those kids came across her remains in mid-January 1983.
Sad.
This is even sadder. Anna's family had already dealt with like this horrible tragedy. Her mother had passed away a few years earlier when Anna was 9, and her
No.
poor dad, he was a firefighter in Camden, New Jersey, and he loses his wife, he loses his daughter.
That has to absolutely like break him. I mean, losing people like that
Mhm.
and in such a short span of time, and also the mysterious way that Anna disappeared or was murdered and found. I mean, that hits you hard, and I don't know how you don't just throw in the towel at that point. And it's funny because I feel like this comes up a lot of times in these true crime cases that some families are just cursed. And I'm not saying that in a bad way, but like this black cloud hangs over, like the murder happens, and then all these other people die, and all these other bad things happen. And it's through no fault of their own. It's just shitty luck.
It is weird how that seems to happen a lot.
Mhm.
So, at first glance, the police have absolutely no idea who killed Anna. They have no leads, no evidence, no suspects. They got nothing. But a week or so after Anna's body was found, a witness would come forward, and what she would have to say would literally shock even like the most experienced, jaded investigator. This woman, 22-year-old Teresa Smith, tells investigators that she has information on who killed Anna Oleszewicz and more. And police are like, what? What
I'm
do you
sorry,
mean
more?
more?
Yeah,
Dot, dot, dot.
more?
All right, buckle in. So, Teresa proceeds to explain that the year prior, so June of 1982, Teresa had actually started living with a friend and that friend's husband in their Asbury Park apartment. Teresa had met this friend, Diane Biegenwald, while they were working together, and Diane invited Teresa to come live with her and her husband, Richard. And this turns into like a weird sister wives relationship, I guess. Like,
Hmm.
both women were sleeping with Richard, and this man was nasty looking. Like, prison time had taken its toll on Richard, and since he's a ruthless killer, like, I don't feel bad saying, he is one ugly fuck. And I just feel like that goes, though, to show, like, how cunning and charismatic he could be, because Diane was stunning, and so was Teresa. They were, like, breathtakingly gorgeous.
I don't care how if you're 50 shades charming, like dude literally looks like a Guess Who character. He's got this stupid little face and the Friar Tuck hair where it's just like hair on the
Yeah.
sides, even when he was young. So it's like, what? Come on.
And his bags are going on a vacation. No, wait, it's his eyes are going on a vacation. Have you seen the bags?
Have you seen the bags? His bags are going on vacation. Have you seen his eyes?
It's so true.
So,
So, as Teresa goes on with her story, police learn that Richard had decided to become Teresa's mentor. He wanted to train her to become a cold-blooded killer just like he was.
Hmm.
He taught her how to shoot a .22, and Teresa would tell investigators exactly what Lou Diamond said, that Richard liked when the bullets rattled around in the skull, like verbatim.
mm-hmm.
And Teresa would tell investigators that Richard would go out at night to essentially hunt for victims, which is exactly what he did with Anna. And the night that he lured Anna off the boardwalk, he took her back to his home. And when they got there, he went inside to try to wake Teresa up. So remember, it was really late.
Yeah.
And he basically like told her to come downstairs and kill this woman with him. So crazy. And it's speculated that Teresa may have been in like a drug-fueled stupor and maybe didn't believe Richard or didn't know what he was saying, but she was like, I'm going back to sleep, leave me alone.
Wow.
Yeah. But the next morning, Richard takes Teresa out to the shed, and there is the body of Anna Oleszewicz.
That's where he did it, in the shed.
Yeah.
Wow.
We think.
I think.
So he brought Teresa out there because he wanted her to touch Anna's body. And in a move that would later come back to haunt him, he took a ring off Anna's finger and gave it to Teresa.
Wow.
Yeah. And Teresa tells police, like, she was horrified and she moved out of the couple's apartment, like, immediately. And spoiler alert, Teresa ends up giving this ring to Diane, and it's later found in Diane's jewelry box. And it was confirmed to be Anna's, and this is really sad, but Anna's boyfriend had given her that ring on the anniversary of her mom's death because she was having such a hard time.
Oh my God.
And the boyfriend ended up IDing the ring at trial.
That's so sick, and it's sad too. I mean, it proves that these victims they meant absolutely nothing to Richard. I mean, they were playthings. It's just
Mhm.
sick, and it's I can't believe she kept that ring too, knowing where it came from.
Yeah, that part's a little strange. I do wonder a little bit.
If she didn't know, it was
Well, Teresa knew because he took it off Anna's finger while
right.
she was laying there, but I wonder a little bit about Teresa, but
Again, we can't
move,
really. Yeah.
moving on. Yeah. So now, about 5 months later, Teresa sees a news report about the body behind the Burger King, and she knows that this body is Anna's.
Hmm.
So she goes to police. And needless to say, the police are stunned. But Teresa isn't done. Richard had befriended another heinous monster. They had met when they were in prison, and now the two of them were working together. So this guy's name was Darren Fitzgerald. And according to John E. O'Rourke's book, Darren was a self-described hitman. And Teresa tells investigators that Darren lived in the same house where Richard lived. So it was like this big house that had been split up into 4 separate, like, low-income apartments.
What are the odds that these two monsters were living together under the same roof?
I don't know. And, like, I don't know if it was set up that way or if it's happenstance. I'm not sure.
Weird.
But they're living together, basically. And Teresa tells police that the men had an absolute arsenal of weapons that they had compiled in the basement of this house. And we're talking guns, we're talking homemade bombs, like
Wow.
crazy stuff. And Darren even had a secret room that he had made in his apartment, and he was supposedly, like, growing weed in there. And the room was behind a mirror. It was like one of those where you could see out, but, like, nobody could see in. They just saw a mirror.
Oh, it's a two-way mirror.
Yeah. And, like, if this story isn't already crazy enough, Richard and Darren were also keeping a highly venomous snake in their basement of horrors because they planned to extract the venom and kill people with it.
Thrill killer is a perfect way to describe him. I mean, they're experimenting on people like kind of some kind of sick doctor.
So great. Like, again, what is Richard thinking? We just cannot figure him out.
He likes to
And
see how things affect other people. Like, you know what I mean?
but
How will people react when I inject them with snake venom? How will people react when I smash them with a rock? How will people react when I shoot them in the
well,
face?
no, because he really only ever shot people. He
Mhm.
just liked to do it. Like,
That's true.
and actually, with the snake venom, they had another chemical that if you put on skin, it could, like, seep into the skin.
Hmm.
They were going to mix the venom with this chemical and put it on the earpieces of payphones.
Oh my god.
So people would pick up the payphone, put it to their ear, and
Yeah.
this poison would seep into their skin and they would die.
God, just to see the world burn.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just for fun.
Hmm.
So at this point, I have to assume that investigators' jaws are on the damn floor with Teresa, especially because Richard Biegenwald was not a name they were familiar with, nor had they come across anything pointing to him, like, in their investigation. And, they don't know if anything that Teresa said is true.
Right.
And even if it is, she is just one witness, so they need more evidence than that. So they decide to kind of get some intel on Richard and Darren. And of course, they look into their backgrounds and they're horrified at what they see. And I've already explained Richard's background, but Darren's is pretty bad too. He had been in prison time and time again for burglary. But in 1966, in a robbery gone wrong, he ended up in a standoff with police. He took 3 hostages. One of those hostages was a Camden police officer. And even after all that and serving prison time, he just could not stay out of trouble, and he had been caught stealing from a store. He blew off the court date, and now there was like a warrant out for his arrest.
How are these men not in prison? I don't understand how they're walking around New Jersey.
This whole case is so beyond frustrating. This is why I was so pissed off last week.
God.
So police are like, holy shit. Like, I can't imagine being these investigators and trying to like process all of this information.
Right.
Teresa just walked in there and dropped bombs. We have murders and felons. We have ties to the mob. We have a basement full of weapons, explosives, and we have a freaking venomous snake. Like,
God.
what is happening? So police have Teresa's story now, and they have this background information on Richard and Darren. And they know that apprehending these men could potentially be incredibly dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
especially since we know that Richard has already been in shootouts with police. Darren had hostages, so they have to plan this out. So they begin putting together a very well choreographed plan to confront and apprehend Richard and Darren, but they have to do it so the other one doesn't know, kind of.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So this plan, it kind of sounds ridiculous, but it does work. At 3 a.m. on January 22nd, 1983, the police go to the house where Richard and Darren lived, and one of the police officers pretends to be a prowler who's like creeping around the house. And so the police catch him and make a big commotion with, "Hold it right there! Police! Blah, blah, blah." And this works. Richard and Diane come outside of their front door to like peep what's going on in their hood. And when they step outside, bam.
That is awesome. I love when the police do these stings because they turn into actors. So it's funny to see them act like they have to play the part
Yes.
to make it real and believable. And I love it. I love when that happens.
And they like literally pounce and they tackle Richard and handcuff him.
So good.
And in that Thrill Killer book, the one investigator's interviewed and he says, quote, "He had that look of I'm fucked. He had that I'm fucked look on his face." End quote.
Good. If anyone deserves it, it's this guy.
Yeah, and I love it. Like, as an investigator, that's gotta be so freaking satisfying.
And I know for a fact it is because the police officers usually hold it together and stay professional. Like when you see a perp walk on the news or a picture of it in the newspaper, the arresting officers are always stone faced and
Oh,
on a
yeah.
mission, all business. But I can tell you with 100% certainty that they definitely celebrate after like reeling in a big fish. We can call it.
Good.
Yeah.
They deserve to.
Yeah.
So, police get Richard in a police car, and they have Diane in a separate one, and they take him to the station, but they still need to get to Darren before he figures out, like, what's going on. So they go to Darren's apartment, and there's a woman there who refuses to let them in, but police are like, we have a warrant. Move out. So after an hour or so, like, so they're in there searching, and after about an hour or so, they can't find him. And one of the officers remembers something Teresa had said about the hidden room behind a mirror. And sure enough, there's a big mirror on the wall. So they go to remove this mirror. They find Darren Fitzgerald sitting in this secret room with a freaking rifle next to him.
Man.
In his crusty tighty whities.
Ooh.
He was watching as the police are like tearing apart his house looking for him.
Oh God. But you would think he would just started blasting. Like I'm surprised he didn't, like knowing you're caught. What do they have to lose at this point?
So I had a whole section about this when I took it out, actually, but I think that he knew it wasn't going to end well for him because he's in this little room. So if he kills one, it's going to break the glass. A bunch of others are going to come in and kill him, you know?
Yeah, but I mean, what's the alternative at this point? You know, I don't know. You've seen it before where the guys will start blasting and then just shoot themselves and it's game over.
Yeah. No, I get it.
I'm surprised he just sat there is all I'm saying.
Right. Well, side note, there was also like a random kid in this apartment. Like I caught all this out because I couldn't go through it. So like that's part of we never hear about, like, as good as this book was, there was a lot that he just was like, yeah, there was a random kid on the couch. Anyway, and
Anyway,
I'm like,
moving on.
whose kid was this? Like, so now police have both men and Diane in custody. And I'm pretty sure everyone is thinking, oh, we've got to be almost done, right? The bad guys are caught. Oh my God, this case is nowhere near over. Pretty soon, several more vicious murders would come to light. But before we get to that, and we will talk about that and Richard's several other victims, I gotta tell you what they found in these apartments. Of course, they were filthy, roaches, trash, nasty. But there were just like homemade explosives laying around the apartments. Like
Wow.
how I have a tissue box on my coffee table, they
You didn't
had,
pipe bomb.
yeah, just sitting there. So police go down to the basement where Teresa said that the men were stockpiling weapons. They walk into like a serial killer's laboratory.
It's good they caught this guy when they did, because God knows what he could have done.
What were they planning?
Yeah.
So there was all this ammunition, there were homemade guns and silencers. They found a copy of the anarchist cookbook.
Mm-hmm.
They found a bunch of chemicals that like could be used as sedatives, and they actually found the drug like used in date rape, like
Wow.
Rohypnol. Is that what it
yeah.
is?
Mm-hmm.
So the basement, like this basement was unhinged. Like the book states, quote, "It was evident they were putting together a deadly combination of weaponry to be used to inflict mass casualties," end quote. And I think that that's clear.
Absolutely.
And of course, in this basement, they find the snake. So this is a specific type of viper snake, and it's known as the puff adder. And it's considered to be one of the world's deadliest creatures. They had made these contraptions to milk the venom. Oh my God, just saying that makes me want to throw up. I don't know why, but I'm so skeeved out.
He was a shooter, he liked to shoot people, but his taste could be evolving a little bit. And this proves that they were experimenting. I mean, it tells me you had a deep
Mhm.
rooted kind of need for control, I think is the best way,
Mhm.
for power,
Yeah.
and literally using human beings to enhance their own twisted psychological gratification. They're thrill seekers, testing the limits. It's pure nightmare fuel when you think about what they're really doing to people.
Yeah. So back at the police station, investigators are trying to interview Richard and Darren separately, of course, and of course, they're both uncooperative.
Mhm.
So now police have to figure out how to move forward. Like, they wholeheartedly believe that there are more victims out there who need justice. And Teresa had kind of alluded to the fact that at least Richard had committed other murders. But after weeks of like searching both apartments, the basement, the shed, the whole property, the police cannot find any evidence of other victims. So it's now April of 1983, and investigators and the prosecutor are getting their case together for the murder of Anna Olesowitz. They get a phone call from the attorney representing Darren Fitzgerald. Apparently, Darren wants to talk, and he will tell the police everything in exchange for a plea deal where the murder charges are dropped. So investigators meet with him, and just like with Teresa Smith, they are shocked. Like, just when you think this couldn't get any crazier, Darren starts talking.
Well, he's going to use that as leverage. I mean, he's going to tell everything,
Everything.
just to
Yes.
better his own situation.
Absolutely. So he tells them he had nothing to do with the actual murders, but he did assist in disposing of the bodies. He tells them how he had met Richard in prison, like way, way back when. They became friends, and I guess they still kept in touch. And Darren then tells the police about another man he had befriended in prison named William Ward. So when Darren and William are both out of prison, they work together as gun runners. And eventually Darren is like, you know what would be really fun? Bringing my other degenerate friend, Richard, into this little business of ours.
Yeah.
And he can be our, air quotes, enforcer.
Hmm.
And apparently William was like, hell yeah, the more the merrier.
Brilliant.
So this is when Richard Biegenwald is brought into the gun running. And while the timeline's a little unclear, I believe a lot of this was happening when Richard was with Diane, and from the outside, it looked like he was staying out of trouble.
Yep. He was staying busy though, behind
Right.
the scenes. Yep.
So police are like with Darren and they're like, okay, cool, but like not sure what this has to do with the murders. Darren was not done. He tells police that one day in the spring of 82, Richard asked Darren to meet him in the shed, and he shows Darren the body of a young woman.
Hmm.
And it's important to note that Darren couldn't see this woman's face because there was a trash bag like taped over it.
Wow.
So later that night, the men cut up the body and put the remains in trash bags and take them to the home of Richard's mom, Sally. And she's still living in Staten Island. Oh my god, and sometime during all of this madness, Darren's curiosity, like, gets the better of him, and he kinda turns to Richard, he's like, "What the hell happened here? Like, why is this woman dead?" Which I feel like are fair questions.
Yeah, but maybe like before all like that would I'd lead with that.
Well, according to the book, Richard says it was business, and that was the extent of the conversation. Then, as they are burying these remains in Sally's backyard, the men are digging and they come across another body.
Oh my god. It's like, yep, hold on, move.
And
Move that
well,
one.
Darren's like, I just imagine they're digging and Darren's like, clink, what?
Yeah.
What?
I'm sorry, what?
And Richard, the only explanation was that it was more business that had gone wrong.
Wow, so he's just clamming up about the whole thing and just
Yep. So, just like they were with Teresa, these investigators are just like, this is made up. Like, what is going on?
yeah.
So then Darren channels his inner infomercial host and he's like, but wait, there's more.
Call now.
Exactly. And he tells everyone how Richard had murdered their fellow gun runner, William Ward.
Wow.
They had gotten into some argument, and I guess Richard was over it because he just shot William in the head.
Yeah, Richard doesn't play. He shoots and just doesn't ask questions.
Exactly. And then Darren assisted him and they buried their friends, well, at least Darren's friend's body in a cemetery. So we have at least 4 victims, and that's not counting Steven Sladowski back in 1958. But we have Anna and we have William. Then we have the woman who Darren helped bury in Sally's yard. And then we have the body who's already buried in Sally's yard.
Let's keep piling up.
Yeah, so I'm sure at this point the police are like, that's gotta be it, right? Right? Please let that be it. But no,
But
there
wait,
was at
there's more.
least one. There's more. There was at least one more victim that Darren knew of, and he didn't have any details other than he helped bury her body in a town about 15-ish minutes away from Asbury Park called Tinton Falls.
Wow.
So now police are aware of at least 5 victims, and they work with Darren to try and get as much information as possible. Apparently, Darren had had enough of Richard, and he actually wanted to be done with him. Richard killed his cat.
Wow. That was the final straw, huh?
Yeah, but
Hmm.
then they found Anna's body, and all hell broke loose. So he didn't get to break up their friendship, whatever.
Yeah.
And whether that's true, who knows? This is really sad, and I don't have a ton of information on Richard's victims, which I hate, but I do want to talk about them. I want to say their names.
Say them loud and proud. I mean, that's what this is about, giving a voice to the voiceless.
Exactly. So we already talked about Anna. So our next victim is Maria Chialella, who was only 17 years old when she was murdered on Halloween night in 1981. I believe she had been at a Halloween party and she was on her way home, and she was seen by a police officer walking along Route 88, but the officer was heading to a call, but he decided he was going to come back that way and offer the girl a drive home so she was safe. But when he returned, just about 10 minutes or so later, there was no sign of the girl. She ended up being one of the bodies found in Sally's backyard. She had been shot in the head.
Man, see that I don't put him in the same category as that cop from last week in the Mayo murders, because the one that just
No.
just saw a car and just didn't feel like dealing with it. Like the cop had somewhere to go, and like a pedestrian, you don't think twice about.
Exactly. He had he was on his way to a call. I believe he
Mhm.
radioed in and said there was a girl walking. I'm going to stop on my way back.
Yeah,
It was all on the up and up.
yeah. He probably still felt really guilty though.
Oh, I'm sure. So our next victim is Deborah Osborne. And she was either 17 or 18 years old. I found conflicting reports, but Deborah went missing on April 5th, 1982, and she was the other body found in Sally's backyard.
Wow.
And there's very limited information on Deborah. She had last been seen at a bar with a girlfriend of hers located on Route 88, which is the same road where Maria was walking. In a weird similarity to Anna's case, the friend went to the bathroom, and when she got back, Deborah was gone.
Hmm.
And this is kind of crazy. Deborah looked very similar to the other victims. They were all young and beautiful with dark eyes and dark hair, like
Hmm.
very Ted Bundy-esque.
Yeah.
But Deborah was not shot in the head like the other victims. She was stabbed 21 times.
Hmm.
And the book noted that, like, people weren't used to seeing that much anger out of Richard. So I'm
Hmm.
not sure what happened there, but Deborah did leave behind her parents and 2 sisters.
It's a strange one because it wasn't his MO, as
Right.
far as I can tell. But again, this guy wasn't above killing by any means necessary. So maybe Deborah fought back or something, and he snapped and just did what he had to do because it was business, you know?
Yeah, that's what I feel like. And then the victim buried in Tinton Falls was 17-year-old Betsy Bacon. She lived in Seagirt, New Jersey, and she was last seen the night of Saturday, November 20th. And it was around 11 p.m., and she was at home, but she decided to run out to pick up a pack of cigarettes. Well, when her family woke up the next morning, they realized she had never come home. So when her body was found, she had been shot in the head twice.
See, that's his MO.
Yeah. So on November 28th, 1983, Richard went to trial for the murder of Anna Olesowitz. And each victim he was charged for had their own trial. And the prosecutor was gunning for the death penalty. And just a little FYI, this case actually made the DA change his stance on the death penalty.
Really?
He had always been really against it. And Richard Biegenwald's horrible, callous, brutal murders, that changed him. And he believed that Richard deserved to die.
It's really funny that in the past couple weeks we've had a detective change his opinion on the death penalty the other way.
Yeah, isn't that what I
Yeah,
was thinking of that when I was researching?
crazy.
And as cold and evil as Richard was, and as much as he loved murdering people, he was a whiny little bitch about being put to death. And this seems to happen like so often in these cases of brutal murderers who did unspeakable things to their victims. They cry and throw tantrums that they don't want to die, and the death penalty is cruel and unusual. Really? Really? You want to talk cruel and unusual, you cowardly little bitch?
Mike Tyson said it best, like 80s Mike Tyson, when he was the baddest man on the planet. He was like,
Mhm.
everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the mouth. And you can translate it to this case. Like these killers are so tough until you get them in front of a judge and in front of a jury. And then all of a sudden, not so tough.
I just love when they're like, "No, don't put me to death. It's cruel and unusual." Like, you are cruel and unusual. What are you talking about,
Everything you've ever
bitch?
done is cruel and unusual.
Exactly. And, like, I need to move on because I will go on a friggin' tangent about this, but, like, I hate when people are so hypocritical.
Yeah.
Like, you did that shit. Now grow a pair, get in the chair, and let me flick that switch.
Do the crime, do the time.
Exactly. But the point of this is that Richard was so upset, he decided to make an offer to the police through his lawyer, or to the prosecutor. In exchange for them taking the death penalty off the table, he would give them the locations of 25 other victims'
Wow.
remains. So I ask you, what would you do? Would you literally make a deal with the devil in this case?
That's so hard because part of me would, because you would get answers for 25 families. You
Yeah,
know, but at the same time, are you not getting justice then for the 4 families that matter, that the
right.
case is about, or the 5 family, however many victims they did find? Are you making them more watered down by. But I would think that those families would want police to, expand this to include everybody that this guy's ever wronged and let the
Yeah.
punishment fit the crime.
And I feel like nowadays, of course, this was back in the 80s, but like nowadays, I feel like unless you're in Texas or Florida, like no one ever gets executed. So I'd
I
be
know.
like, sure, dude,
Yeah,
like that's
whatever.
totally fine.
Yep, whatever you want.
Well, the prosecutor said, no deal. And according to that Thrill Killer book, both the prosecutor and the defense attorney, Lou Diamond again, but they were both pretty incredible, like in this trial. And the trial lasted about a week, and when it came time to deliberate, the jurors took 6.5 hours to determine that Richard Biegenwald was guilty of capital murder in the case of Anna Oleszewicz. And just a week later, on December 8th, 1983, which, by the way, is like right when this episode will air. It'll be like December 10th, I think.
Isn't that crazy?
It's so weird. We did that last week with the Mayo murders.
We planned that. That's how much planning goes into this.
Yeah, we're totally legit. But a week later, on December 8th, 1983, Richard Biegenwald was sentenced to death by lethal injection.
Good.
He did not show a single flicker of any kind of emotion.
Is he dead?
Oh, yeah,
Good,
he's dead.
Good.
So he was found guilty and charged for either life in prison or death, like in the murders of Betsy Bacon, Maria Colella, Deborah Osborne, and William Wade.
Mhm.
They were never able to definitively tie him to anyone else. Although investigators have their suspicions, they did mention a couple people that they're pretty sure he killed, but
Mm.
and there were so many appeals and retrials over the years, like as there always is with death penalty. I get that.
Yeah.
But he was so annoying about it. But thank God, on March 10th, 2008, this vile piece of crap did the only good thing that he ever did in his life. He dropped dead.
Oh, good.
He was 67 years old, which kind of sucks. Like, I'm so glad he's dead, but like, I wish he suffered longer.
Yeah, he got off easy. But good riddance.
Exactly. He was a chain smoker and he died of like lung and heart problems.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, that's cruel and unusual.
Yeah, that sounds cruel and unusual.
So Darren Fitzgerald, his accomplice, sort of, he had made that plea deal. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. I think he did serve that entire sentence. I don't know what he's doing now. Oh, and apparently Diane never came to see Richard once he was in prison. I don't think he ever heard from her again.
I think we should see other people.
Yeah. By the way, the media called them, when this was in trial, they called Diane and Richard Beauty and the Beast.
Oh,
Because
wow.
she was so gorgeous and he was so fucking ugly. Oh, and apparently Diane was pregnant like around the trial and she gave birth to a little girl in August of 83. But like the show and the book just kind of breezed over that. So I don't
That
have
was
any
the
more.
kid sitting in that one room. The random kid.
The random kid, exactly.
Never know. It all coming together.
But that is the case of the Jersey Shore thrill killer.
Wow.
And he was definitely deserving of that title because he just liked to kill. That's what he enjoyed. Whereas I enjoy crafting and you enjoy cooking.
I do.
But like, what a crazy case. Like, we had so much. We had shootouts and hostages and the mob and venomous snakes.
So much.
And
And weird hair and guess who people.
yes. And by the time I got to the snake, I was kind of just like, this shit has gone off the rails. Like,
now you're just
what is
making it up.
happening?
None of this happened. You are making all this up.
I was like reading this and I was like, did I just read that right? Like, what is going on?
That's freaking wild. Yeah, the story's really interesting. I mean, the guy is sick and I'm glad he's dead. I'm sorry he didn't live out his sentence. Like you said, I think he kind of got off easy. But
Yeah.
The people that murder for fun are the worst kind of people.
100%.
Yeah, no regard for human life.
No, they just don't care. Like, to them, it's no big deal.
Yeah.
Well, I would love to know what our listeners think. I want to know what they think about Sally, Richard's mom. Like, do you feel like she did her best or do you feel like she screwed up? Like, I don't
I feel like she didn't spend enough time in the yard, or she would have seen piles of dirt and dead
Yeah,
bodies.
right?
Like,
You would think that if you wake up and, your yard is all torn up, you'd ask some questions,
have
but
some coffee outside, lady. Like, there's stuff going on.
like I said, I think she was a little naive. But I would also love to know, listeners, what you would do in the case of, do you make a deal for those 25 victims?
Mhm.
And if you want to let us know, you can hit us up on Insta, Facebook, TikTok at Murder Unscripted. You can email us at murderunscriptedpod@gmail.com. And please, please, please rate, review, and subscribe. If you leave a review, screenshot it, send it to us. We will send you a super sweet MU sticker.
They are sweet. And there's glittery ones. There's ones with borders. There's ones without borders. There's ones with uneven borders because we kind of cut them haphazardly. So we'll cut them nice though before we send them. Cut
I
them
don't
real
know how to
nice.
use a paper cutter, even though they're supposed to be easier than scissors.
You hand me these stacks of stickers, and I have to recut every one before I mail them out.
I'm only allowed safety scissors, so see my
Not surprising. For
right.
the best.
Well, on that note, everyone, have a great week. Be nice, be kind, don't be a dick, don't play with venomous snakes, and remember, perverts don't wear signs that say they're perverts.
They don't, and I still don't feel good, so I don't feel like coming up with anything funny. They don't.
And honestly, I'm starting to fade, and I'm starting to lose my voice. So good night, everyone.
Good night.
I almost didn't cover this case because I was so overwhelmed. Loose. Jesus Christ. What are you doing? She got in a fight. She got in a fight with the curtain and she lost. Now we're in 1980. And Azaf... don't even know what I just said there.
Zap.
So he and a friend, Jimmy Sparnroft, and just a disclaimer, I've seen like 3 different names for this guy, but in the book, he was Jimmy Sparnroft, so that's what we're going to go with.
You picked I would, if there was like if he was Jimmy Davis, something easy to pronounce, I would have went with that one.
I know, right? I should have picked the easiest one.
You're like, I went with Sparnroft.
So we'll just call him Jimmy from here on out.
Perfect.
This case is wild and it's unhinged, but it's not super well known.
Just like you. Wild, unhinged, and not well known.
And not super well known. It's going to be the title of my autobiography. So, on this World's Most Evil Killer show, they had Richard's defense attorney on the show, Lou Diamond. Lou Diamond is a trip.
Is he selling watches behind the courthouse?
Actually, now that I think about it, in the Saved by the Bell episode, when that ring salesman sold Zach the fake rings and it turned everyone's finger green, wasn't his name Lou Diamond?
Was it Lou Diamond? Oh my God.
I think it was.
Pause immediately what we're doing. His name was Gem Diamond.
So maybe he Luke's
so lame.
little brother.
This is Ray Diamond. That's called a consigliere. Do you know that? Do you ever watch The Godfather?
No.
The lawyer for the mob is called the consigliere.
That's our boy Lou.
That's my mom.
That was great.
That's all I got.
I felt like Vito Corleone was sitting across from me.
Vito who? I'm sorry.
What's his last name? Corleone?
Capicola?
Capricorn? I don't know. Capricorn?
Corleone. We'll watch The Godfather sometime. All 3 of them in succession. So
I know
block
there's a horse head.
block off about 9 hours.
Oh my God.